Hello, and welcome to this presentation entitled Pride to Ambivalence, Errors in the Historiography of Latin American Commercial Law. And just a brief bit of exposition on the title itself, Pride to Ambivalence. The errors of historiography in Latin American commercial law run for about 12 decades or so, beginning in the early part of the 20th century. And that's where we're talking about the pride, as some of the early scholars in this area, many of whom were former or current members of government or academia or the diplomatic corps, were taking immense pride in the achievements of the post-colonial legal system that was developing uniquely in the former colonial holdings of Latin America. Throughout the decades, that pride has, in a certain fashion, led to a type of ambivalence about the ultimate effect that commercial law may have on the economic development of Latin American nations. And in the middle, we have, in the early part of the 20th century, a lot of detailed academic examinations about how reform might lead to a more efficient and productive economic system when coupled with a more forward-thinking commercial legal regime. And that's sort of what the basis of our title would be in terms of Pride to Ambivalence as we examine these eras in the commercial law development of Latin America. Again, the historiography of Latin America has a history of about 100 years in terms of its academic life. And despite all this, there is still a lack of consensus on a lot of the core principles. Therefore, there are, which is not unusual, I suppose, in any academic debate, but there are a lot of vigorous disagreements interspersed from the early 20th century to the present day as to the strengths and the failures of the civil law system. And this is sort of where we have, this dichotomy among many of the academic opinions about whether reform is possible or even if it's necessary. And even if we're talking, about two truly interrelated things when we're talking about civil law reform and economic growth in Latin America. The three areas that need to be addressed, or that I think are most important here, are the first era, where statesmen and scholars of the early 20th century, once again, writing with that pride of post-independent accomplishment, we're also beginning to look at the challenges of competing in an ever more complex world as the nations of Latin America are having to compete with and engage with, the foreign Iberian or other European nations, while at the same time with the Anglo nations of North America. And one of these most important post-independent figures in the academic development of the historiography of Latin American commercial is this gentleman, Dr. Alejandro Alvarez, who was a Chilean attorney. He was also a member of the International Court of Justice for several years and a renowned legal scholar in the early 20th century, who wrote a very detailed treatise, which was published in 1909, dealing with the legal history in the post-colonial world up to and including the time in which he was living. And he reached a conclusion that the amalgamated legal structure of most Latin American nations needed reform in order to thrive and to compete with the other nations in the Western, Anglo nations in the Western Hemisphere. And his quote here, taken from one of his most famous survey articles, is that although the Latin states of America inherited the civilizations of the peoples of Europe, they developed along different lines. In number and in the fact of their common origin, they were like members of one large family who had been suddenly and almost simultaneously called into independent life. And he concludes then that the uniqueness of this development, or the historical underpinnings of this development, led many of the Latin American nations in developing their legal codes and their civil codes, despite the fact that they had similarities to the underlying Spanish codes themselves, had their own unique gloss, and that there were certain things, specifically the public law of the European nations that they simply refused to or failed to adopt as they grew along their own lines of development in the post-independent decades. And that these principles and practices, as he notes, were incompatible with their independent position. The principles and practices of European civil law nations, while at the same time of the common law Anglo nations of the United States primarily and Great Britain at the time. These practices were incompatible with their independent position, or that they did not favor their special conditions of development. This era that Dr. Alvarez was writing with, was writing in during the early part of the 20th century, also had another renowned scholar who was writing in the same, and that's E.S. Ceballos, who, in addition to being a eminent legal scholar and economic historian, had also served as the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Argentina, over a 20-year period. In reading his articles, he acts, very much as a cheerleader for post-independence legal growth. He sees in his own Argentinian legal codes that were developed, in the mid to late decades of the 19th century as one of the crowning achievements, not simply of post-independent Latin America, but in all jurisprudence. And while recognizing the fact that there are inefficiencies in a civil code-based legal regime, that because of their own laudatory aspects, the civil law codes should not be jettisoned simply because there is the belief at the time that he was writing that the common law economic system of, once again, Great Britain, the United States, Australia, India at this time, and everything else, would lead to greater economic outcomes. His belief was that the civil law legal societies, of which almost every Latin American nation, participated, could compete with these Anglo nations while once again, maintaining their own unique identity. As we move into the second era in which this presentation, wishes to touch upon in terms of these three areas of the historiography of Latin American commercial law, we come to the recodification period. We're jumping ahead, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, when that optimism about the ability of a civil code-based society to compete with a common law-based society economically, and we're only talking economically. We're not doing an analysis of whether the civil code societies versus the common law societies were better in terms of protecting individual rights, were better in protecting, the rights of the citizenry for redress from their government, were better at protecting freedom of press or association. That is not the focus of our examination. Our examination is simply whether that part of the private law, which encompasses the commercial aspects of individuals and entities interplaying with the government, how that is affecting economic growth in the Latin American nations, post-independent Latin American nations. And this is where we talk about the recodification. By the middle of the 20th century, most scholars, reflecting the fact that most governments in Latin America were significantly updating, modifying, or changing their own civil law codes in order to address sort of the lagging economic growth of Latin America in comparison with the post-World War II common law nations and other civil law nations of Europe and some of the civil law nations of Asia. But once again, as we're discussing in Dr. Alvarez's analysis here, the civil law nations, the civil law legal underpinnings of Latin America were different than the civil law legal independent, underpinnings of, for example, Europe. Why they were both still civil law societies, as opposed to common law societies in which judges and courts have greater say in the interpretation and the protection of individual rights and equities, because they grew differently because of the unique part of Latin America that there was the economic, I beg your pardon, the academic view was that these civil code societies weren't efficient enough, and therefore the civil codes of which Dr. Savalas was so proud, and saw little need for reform or updating, that view was being challenged and was giving way, beginning in the mid 20th century to the need to update those civil codes to reflect modern realities. And one of the scholars of that era, who was in the early 1970s when sort of it was peaking, was Professor Boris Kozalczyk, who reached the opinion that we were focusing on the wrong things in Latin America. That while Latin American societies were focusing on updating their civil codes to reflect modern realities, that was sort of a pointless exercise, because updating civil codes, essentially making sure that the words on paper make sense, is far less important to the economic efficiency of a society than for that society to understand that there is legal credibility and legal utility in the commercial law aspect, which would allow for that economic growth to succeed and to perpetuate. In other words, it's not the issue that our civil codes are not modern enough, or that they are not amended enough, or that they are sort of, too linked to the past. It is the fact that they are still civil codes, rather than a common law society, which once again focuses on fairness and equity, rather than, rigid adherence to the civil law as it is specifically laid down and written in civil law societies. And so this was a influential type of analysis that says you can't reform, sort of a broken house or a broken foundation. You just need to, you need to break the foundation and pour a new one. And in Professor Kozalczyk's view, that new one would be much similar to the common law commercial system that we would have in the United States or in Great Britain or anything else, or in other common law societies. At the same time as this, we have a different economic view, a different conclusion as to the commercial law issues in the mid-20th century from Tulane professor Rodolfo Petissa, whose belief was this doesn't have anything to do with the fact that a common law system is going to be more efficient, or that we need more equitable courts, or that even that the civil codes themselves are not efficient enough. They are not clearly written enough, or whatever the issue may be. In his view, it's that there is a fundamental issue and dynamic in the Latin American nations which makes recodification, which makes modern type of reform, the ability of Latin American nations to compete in an economic world dominated by, at this time, and even through today, dominated by common law, nations. That the issue is the very nature of Latin American economic society, with the difference between in the way you're treated in an industrial versus a mercantile, sphere in the Latin American nations, is what is going to make it so much more difficult to sort of create a uniformity, commonality, or predictability in commercial law, especially among nations. The way that economic law and commercial law is perpetuated and presented in the United States, or in the United Kingdom, or in India, or in other these common law nations, is extremely incompatible or dismissive of these type of cultural distinctions between industrialism and mercantilism in Latin American economic life, and the way those two things are treated. based upon the relationships that are established in a mercantilistic regime versus an industrialistic regime. And so he disagrees, with Professor Kozalczyk that the primary issue here is we're focusing on the wrong system, and he disagrees with the recodification scholars who are saying we're not modifying the existing codes fast enough. He is pointing out sort of a perhaps insurmountable cultural issue here that cannot be legislated away necessarily, that cannot be recodified away, or it is not simply as easy as jettisoning one system for another based upon all of the cultural issues involved. And then the third area, that we would like to examine in terms of the three eras of historiography of Latin American commercial law is sort of the modern era, beginning in the last decade of the 20th century and leading into the first 2 decades of the 21st century. Is now we have gone far enough. Enough time has passed that scholars are able to look back, over 100 years of historiographical writing and scholarship, that we're not looking, as Alvarez and Ceballos were at the very beginning, trying to look forward. We've now come 125 years, and we have the ability to sort of look back at the academic development and the academic theories from, looking back at the post-independence period and how the civil law and commercial law system of Latin America has developed, and whether it needs to develop further in terms of supporting further economic efficiency and growth, or whether the two are even linked at all. And one of the scholars who has written on this is Professor Jorge Esquivel, who is pushing back about the very concept of law reform, to the degree that it is almost condescending that whenever a nation is seeking international advice or seeking international aid or assistance as it is, progressing in its development and meshing further with the modern industrial world, that somehow means that there is some deficiency in the nation itself. For example, of international aid or business development or legal advice or institutional advice is sought from the United States, that must mean then that there has been a failure of Latin American legal law in and of itself. And Professor Esquivel would disagree with that and say that this doesn't mean that there is a problem that needs to be remedied by a U.S.-sponsored theory or institution. It simply means that in the process of trade and in the process of the relationship between nations, there are going to be a give and take, and there's going to be a best practice, and there's going to be a worst practice, and we're going to sort of work through all these things. But that doesn't mean that the Latin American system is a failure by any stretch of the imagination. Once again, pushing back against the theories of Kozalczyk and the theories that somehow there is something in the DNA of Latin American commercial law which is always going to require a remedy. And once again, academics are pushing back against that theory in this new third era that we are examining. And at the same time, we have Professor Rodrigo Cassino, who challenges the very notion that there is necessarily a relationship between legal stability and market development to begin with. And once again, the focus of this presentation and the focus of our historical examination of the historiography of Latin American commercial law is sort of based upon the premise that there is an absolute relationship between commercial law and economic development. That the two have to coexist together. As one pulls, the other pulls. As one acts, the other one must react. That in order to have an efficient and growing economic system, we must have a rational and uniform and equitable commercial legal system in order for that to happen. And that is sort of what was the general view of the scholars writing in the first two eras. Now, Professor Cassino challenges that to begin with, and states in his belief that, in short, the Latin American social context challenges most of the assumptions that support the standard discourse of legal reform. And we're going, even back to the writings of Alvarez, who is pointing that out. We're developing economically, despite the fact that we are seeking or have sought independence from Iberian civil law nations, and despite the fact that we are building upon the existing Spanish law, we are developing differently. And because of this, that the way that the legal system will operate and the commercial system will operate in the Latin American countries by its very nature is going to be different. And this includes the interplay between the interest of the state and the interest of the dominant groups, sustained market development under oligarchic or dictatorial political structures, and the lack of centrality of the state in providing legal solutions and daily realities. And he believes all these need to be kept in mind when talking about legal reform. And in fact, even concludes in the articles that he has written that the very premise that you must have a free, open, and efficient commercial legal system in order to have economic development can be challenged just by looking at some of the other nations in South America contemporaneous to the time he was writing, or just a few decades before he was writing. Specifically, the Fujimori government in Peru, or the Pinochet government in Chile, or the Argentinian government in the post-Peron area, that you could see economic growth and development sometimes at very high levels, while at the same time you have authoritarian dictatorial governments and very little true legal commercial freedom. And so we've sort of come full circle from discussing how important the commercial law was and how important it is to properly reform it if we're going to have economic development throughout the post-independent Latin American nations, to a belief, and this is sort of where we're coming to the ambivalence, that a lot of scholars are sort of ambivalent about whether or not there is even a connection at all. And that, we're probably focusing on the wrong things. We always need to focus less on the legal and the more on the political. That ultimately the political is going to control, all other aspects of what is going to happen here. And you can have whatever legal system you want, commercial, in the commercial context, whether civil or common law. But if the political environment is contrary, or if the political environment has a goal that is different than what the economic actors may choose to may favor, then the particular legal system you have is going to be irrelevant, whether it be a civil or a common law regime. And that is sort of where it's coming to a final set of arguments, which no one has said before. There hasn't been a final word on this and a final consensus on this, if there ever is, in these economic arguments. But now we sort of have those three philosophical views that, while they developed in these three different eras, are all sort of competing against each other now. And just as a final sort of aside, and this goes back to what several of the academics have talked about, is that the central theme of many of the scholars is that reform of the existing civil code, as opposed to that it needs to be more akin or analogous to the American common law system based on uniformity, is the subjective versus objective nature of civil law, which creates distinctions between industry and mercantilism in Latin American civil societies that, to be honest, common law nations have a very difficult time comprehending. That the common law system, because it's based on what is fair, what is a fair relationship between two parties, whether it be in contract, whether it be in trade, or what have you, that all of these other cultural issues about mercantilism versus industrialism, and how you will treat a one-on-one economic transaction versus a multinational transaction, that ultimately it's all a bottom line economic efficiency issue. And that, once again, a lot of these scholars have pointed out that is simply incompatible or is simply not taking into account these cultural issues of subjectivity versus objectivity that underpin a lot of Latin American economic history and Latin American economic development. And so finally, our conclusion by looking at these three eras would be that while the historiography of Latin American commercial law and business history is fairly limited in terms of what there might be out there in a historiographic analysis of women's rights, or in terms of civil rights, constitutional developments, military issues. While those may be much broader and more developed topics, there is enough information, there's enough now laid down in the issue of Latin American commercial law for us to draw certain conclusions. And one of the conclusions is, talking about some of these articles of the previous scholars, is how important history remains, how important these cultural relationships are, not simply in an esoteric fashion, but also in an everyday lived experience fashion, that we can't simply amend the statute to make the economic aspect work better or to make the commercial legal system more efficient. There's not some best practice that we will simply implement tomorrow. It is like much of the life and culture of Latin America, legal reform in the commercial context or in the public law context requires an understanding of how history and experience still permeates so much of the life of the former Iberian colonies. And as we are concluding here, change when it comes must negotiate with those experiences and emotions which are alive as much today as they were 200 years ago. We all, from whatever state we arise from whatever political philosophy we have, from whatever national origin we have, history is important to our view of the world, but I think in the United States, and I think in certain, European nations and everything else, there isn't this permeation of history coloring a lot of the everyday economic interactions and legal interactions as there is in Latin America, which once again, we'll go back to Alvarez and others who will talk about it, is very much a reflection of what happens in the post-independent era of which we arose. Taking, of Europe, but not of Europe, and developing upon our own course because of the circumstances in which these nations were born, and that we need to understand that, and that there's not simply, the view that, Kolacek may have that, just pick a different system and everything will be fine. That's whether that is true or not, whether one system is preferable to another or not. That is never going to be an easy answer to the issue of potential reform in Latin American commercial law and how that will affect ultimate economic development. And so that is our presentation and our discussion, and we appreciate your listening, and we appreciate your thoughts and your comments. Thank you very much.